to give you news you can use. Here's the act. Okay, you can look it up, HR 6090. So what is this basically saying? This is basically saying that if anybody that's protesting that either calls a name or does something to that person and makes the school look bad, that could take away the funding for the school. So people are protesting pretty much because they're saying we don't agree with what's happening with this war. And if companies in America are supplying materials to the people in those wars who are killing people, then they need to stop. So we're going to protest. But then the government's saying, if you're protesting and cause trouble, then we're going to stop funding that college that you're going to. Wow. So is it kind of like a catch-22? An interesting thing is they did that back in 1970 at the Kent State riots. And started out peaceful, Cambodian War. They were protesting, but they were saying that the National Guard was following them. And some protesters supposedly started throwing rocks and everything. And then some of the National Guard, maybe some of them were trigger happy, but maybe they were defending themselves. And as they started defending themselves, then the Kent State people started defending themselves. And then from there, like I said, it went kind of crazy. So we have to remember again that you're doing stuff in the present. But let's hopefully learn from the past and have a peaceful protest. You're watching yours truly, Anthony Parker, with Keeping It Honest. Viewer discretion is advised, as I've been showing down at the screen. And you're going to see some things here that, well, you might feel uncomfortable with, but we have to put the truth out there like we always do. We try to give the left side, we try to give the right side. At the end of the day, like I say, we try to let you decide, and hopefully you've got the truth. But let's look at this story in depth, what's happening now.
We're following some breaking news from overnight. Just look at your screen. Things are getting heated on college campuses from coast to coast as protesters call for an end to the war in Gaza. Protesters taking over UCLA and Columbia University.
Cleo Green joins us this morning from our Breaking News Center with the latest developments, Cleo. And when you see these images, certainly shocking.
Yeah, the images are alarming. Mark D, the protests are not peaceful by any. Let's take a closer look at the video that we've been combing through overnight. At UCLA here, no officers could be seen during violent clashes between the pro-Palestinian encampment and counter-protesters, students attacking each other. Pro-Israeli demonstrators, they surrounded that pro-Palestinian encampment, spraying pepper spray, and then some setting off fireworks. Multiple injuries have been reported, and we are working to find out just how many and how serious. Now, hours earlier at Columbia University in New York, police, they used a SWAT truck to get inside of a window and clear a room taken over by protesters for nearly 20 hours. Nearly 50 people were arrested, their hands zip tied. Now, the decision for police to move in came at the request of Columbia University's president, who said the building occupation, the encampments here, and related disruptions pose a clear and present danger. This morning, the police commissioner sharing why these protests are taking a violent turn.
Agitators.
Now, here in Texas, Whiteley is in Austin, where we could see yet another huge protest.
Discovered I got a flat.
So there you go. Wow. Those protests, they're continuing. Hopefully they won't get to a point where they forget what they're protesting about. So what we're going to do next is we're going to go now and you're going to hear some and see some witnesses from Kent State, the 1970 protest, which turned bad. And when you listen to their stories, watch their stories, hopefully you will remember, hey, you know what? That's what happened then. Man, let's pray this doesn't happen now. Questions, comments, you can email yours truly at parkerman2011@gmail.com, parkerman2011@gmail.com. And we're going to talk about the Kent State story and why, if you don't do things the right way, and I'm going to keep saying that, you don't do things the right way, then you're going to tend to review it again, go back to it. And we don't want to go back to it because it wasn't a good thing. Over 50 years ago, people are still talking about it. So we're going to talk about it right now. And we're going to have one of the people who was a witness to the Kent State shooting and how it affected him then, how it affected America, how it's still affecting us now.
Monday morning, a normal school day, students are being dropped off by their parents. Some may be going directly to class, some may be going to their dorm to get their books and change something or whatever. It's a normal class time event. People are going to cross. You've got 18,000 students going from dorms to administration buildings to teaching buildings, and they all need to be someplace. And some wanted to heard about the rally, so some were going to stop on the Commons where the Victory Bell was. And they kind of separated themselves out. By this point in time, after the weekend, there was a group of kids who were definitely quite upset that the National Guard had taken over the campus. The National Guard seemed to be running the show. The administration had kind of stepped back and said, we're out of this. And so I would say the main core of that group would be between 300 and 600 people on the closest to the Guard down by the Victory Bell. When I say close to the Guard, I mean 300 yards. And then behind them, that group were other students who were kind of like watching because they saw an angry group, and then they saw the National Guard still pretty far away. And they were the watchers. They were just kind of like hanging out, and some of the students had books in their hands. And at this point in time, I had decided I'm going to go down and take pictures. So I took pictures as I went down the hill from Taylor Hall to where the Guard were. I went straight down the hill, and then I went to my left to the sidewalk that goes down between Taylor and Johnson Hall down to the student union at the time. And I actually showed my press pass to the Guard and got behind their lines. So I was able to do some photography before I got there and after I got behind the National Guard.
At approximately 11:30, General Canterbury returns to the campus after the meeting with other officials at the Kent Fire.
So I want you to start remembering some of this as we're putting this story together. So again, 4 people were killed. Students, Allison Krause, 19, Jeffrey Glenn Miller, 20, Sandra Lee Schumer, 20, and William Knox Schroeder, 19. So there's 4 people that killed. And they were among the 300 students that were there. They were there again at Kent State to protest the expansion of the Cambodian campaign. This is which President Richard Nixon had announced in an April 30 television address. So some of them were there And they were observing the proceedings, just people just walking around, protesting peaceful, about 300 yards away. So it shows you that, and as this guy will tell you, that the National Guardsmen were patrolling like people do, and the protesters were protesting, and then something just spoke to maybe some confusion. It spoke the protesters, it spoke the National Guardsmen, and then I said, the shootings happened. Under a minute it took. After this, there was chaos when they started shooting, and a lot of people, to this day, their life has been changed.
House, believing the Ohio National Guard is in full control. He sees the students gathering on the commons, but does not perceive any threat, since it's a small group of students that have gathered. As classes begin to let out for the lunch hour and not fully understanding the student movements, Canterbury suddenly becomes concerned as with each minute that passes, more and more students are arriving on the commons. This photo by Howard Ruffner has two students that just stopped to see what was happening: Sandy Scheuer and William Schroeder. Howard's next photo has Jeff Miller, Marianne Vecchio, Steve Sharoff, and Dean Kaler. On Friday, the history students had called for the Monday, May 4th rally, but now everyone was just watching and waiting.
It was decided that there would be no speakers at this rally, that there would be, that nobody wanted to be arrested, so there wasn't going to be any forerunner or front man to it. But I believe that most of the people that were stopping by at noon were simply there to see what the small group down in front of the Victory Bell were going to pull off.
At approximately 11:45, Canterbury, concerned that the number of students had grown so rapidly, holds a meeting to discuss dispersing the students from the area.
There's a curfew on this campus, there's no rallies permitted, and you're not going to have a rally here. And by now, the crowd behind the initial crowd is a lot of students. I guess why I talk about 1,000 students or whatever, but as you went up further up the hill, there are more students, and the students that were further up the hill were less engaged. The further up the hill you went, the less politically engaged the students were. You go from being engaged to watching closely to being just an observer to being somebody, I'll hang around for a few minutes and I got to go to class. The balcony at Taylor Hall was filled with people who were just watching.
Okay, and it's interesting. In April 1970, so Nixon told Congress that he would end undergraduate student draft deferments by executive order, meaning they wouldn't have to be drafted, if authorized by Congress to do so. So this request was approved by the Senate Armed Services Committee on April 23rd. After the draft reform, students could only postpone their service until the end of the semester. And this is still the law today, something that hasn't changed. Wow. So on Thursday, April 30th, President Nixon announced that the Cambodian incursion had been launched by United States Combat Forces. Wow. So Friday, May 1st, at Kent State University, a demonstration with about 500 students was held on May 1st on the Commons. That's what you saw, a grassy knoll in the center of campus, traditionally used as a gathering place for rallies and protests. That's what people kind of got together. As the crowd dispersed to attend classes by 1 p.m., another rally was planned for May 4th to continue the protests of the expansion of the Vietnam War into Cambodia. And you wonder if that expansion hadn't took place, would there ever be a Kent State? There was widespread anger. People were upset. Wow. And they said, bring the war home. A group of history students burned a copy of the United States Constitution to symbolize even that Nixon had killed it. Why is the ROTC building still standing? One of the Demonstrators asked. Okay, because it should be standing, we should not be burning that down. Wow. A further protest organized by the Black United Students, BUS, also took place during the afternoon in order to demonstrate solidarity with anti-war protests in Kent State and nearby Ohio State University. It attracted around 400 students and ended peacefully at 3:45 p.m.
This is a singled out crowd, the crowd at the bell. There was another crowd of 500 or 600 people behind the ropes at the ROTC building at the other end of the area. And there was one by the tennis court, and there was one on the other side. But the only crowd singled out for being rallied was the crowd in front of the Victory Bell.
William McGuire's photo of students near the Victory Bell captures Allison Krauss walking in the area.
And remember, Allison Krauss is the one that got killed.
Terry Norman is photographed watching and photographing students near the Victory Bell.
Terry Norman was a part-time Kent State student who was taking photographs of demonstrators for both the campus police and the FBI. And he came to the rally with his camera to take photographs, and he had a concealed gun. He's as far as we know, he's the only person, non-guardsman, non-law enforcement, who was carrying a gun that day.
And people even thought that this guy was also a plant and worked for the authorities.
At roughly 11:48, someone starts ringing the Victory Bell and the students begin chanting in protest. Within 1 minute, campus police officer Rice begins using a bullhorn to tell students to leave the area immediately. He can barely be heard over the chanting of the students.
I decided to go out and try to find a position where I could see the guard and see the students in front of the Victory Bell. Had a couple of Nikons around my neck, telephoto lens, wide angle lens. Around noon, the radical folk down in front of the Victory Bell got a little more boisterous and took the notice of the guard.
So as he keeps talking about the guardsmen, and I'm telling the stories, let me know what you think about this. Were there some anxious National Guardsmen, or were there some anxious demonstrators? So on Friday, May 1st, following President Nixon's arrival at the Pentagon later that day, after he arrived, he was greeted by a group of Pentagon employees, with one female employee commenting in regards to Nixon's speech announcing the launch of a Cambodian incursion. She said, "I loved your speech. It made me proud to be an American." This prompted Nixon's controversial response. It's very controversial. He said, "You see these bums, blowing up the campuses. Listen, the boys that are on the college campuses today are the luckiest people in the world, going to the greatest universities, and here they are burning up the books, storming around this issue, you name it. Get rid of the war. There will be another one." Now, how many people might be saying that today? So think about this as you're watching this. We're talking about Kent State, the riots, and we're talking about the unrest at college campuses today.
The guard, I believe it was actually not the guard, but the sheriff. It was a police presence of some sort that got out the bullhorn and explained to us that it was an illegal assembly and we must disperse. And nobody really took much heed.
At roughly 11:52, since the students have not moved, Officer Rice gets into a Jeep with 3 National Guardsmen. They begin driving out towards the students at the Victory Bell and make loops around the Commons. The students chant louder, many making gestures towards Rice and the National Guardsmen, and finally, someone throws a rock towards the Jeep.
And again, so that's where it starts. Somebody threw a rock. Was this the point where the demonstrators really incited the National Guardsmen? So let's go back Saturday, May 2nd, with the National Guard. So the decision to call in the National Guard was made at 5 p.m., but the Guard did not arrive in town that evening till about 10 p.m. By this time, a large demonstration was underway on the campus, and the campus building was burning. The arsonists were never apprehended, and no one was injured by the fire. That part was good, but this started Saturday, so it was slowly starting to build up. There were reports that some Kent firemen and police officers were struck by rocks and other objects while attempting to extinguish the blaze. Several fire engine companies had to be called. And then Sunday, the next day, during a press conference, Governor Rose, at the time very emotional, he can be heard in a recording of a speech. He called the student protesters un-American, referring to them as revolutionaries set on destroying higher education in Ohio. We've seen here at the city of Kent, especially, probably the most vicious forms of campus-oriented violence yet perpetrated by dissident groups. They make definite plans of bombing, destroying, and throwing rocks at police and at the National Guard and the Highway Patrol. This is when we're going to use every part of the law enforcement agency of Ohio to drive them out of Kent. We're going to educate the problem. We're not going to treat the symptoms. And these people just moved from one campus to the other and terrorized their community. They're worse than the brown shirts and the communist element, and also the night riders and the vigilantes. They're the worst type of people that we harbor in America. Now I want to say this. They are not going to take over the campus. I think that we're up against the strongest, well-trained militant revolutionary group that has ever assembled in America. Wow. So he's not doubling down. He's saying, okay, well, you guys are going to do this. And this is before Monday. And we're going to make sure we stop you from doing that. Wow. Rose also, and this the governor, claimed he would obtain a court order declaring a state of emergency that would ban further demonstrations and give the impression that a situation akin to martial law has been declared. However, he never attempted to obtain such an order. You would think maybe that would have made it worse. But this is before Monday. It's slowly building. You're watching the outcome on May 4th.
After 5 minutes of the Jeep driving around the commons and seeing that students were not leaving the area and only getting louder, Major Harry Jones of the Ohio National Guard runs out onto the commons to have the Jeep returned back to the ROTC area. Orders are given to use chemical agents to get the students to move from the area around the Victory Bell. And at approximately 11:57, Major Jones moves forward with several National Guardsmen to deploy tear gas.
So now they're deploying tear gas because they're saying that the demonstrators aren't dispersing. So at about noon, the National Guard obtained a bullhorn from the University Police Department and used it to order the crowd to disperse, just what we saw. However, the announcement was too faint to hear as it got no response from the crowd. Campus Patrolman Harold Rice, accompanied by 3 guardsmen, then approached the crowd in a National Guard Jeep, again using the bullhorn to order the students to disperse. So he's in this Jeep telling people you need to move. Students responded now by making obscure gestures at the Jeep, singing protest songs and chanting. At some point, a few rocks were thrown at the Jeep as it drove by the crowd, with one rock striking the Jeep and a second one striking a guardsman, both without causing any damage. The crowd ignored repeated orders to disperse. So if you have the military, it's kind of like the police. If the police say stop, put your hands up, keep your hands on the wheel, then that's what you do. Why do you defy authority if it's trying to rectify the situation. So after that, after the crowd failed to listen to them, then the guardsmen were ordered to fire tear gas from their grenade launchers, but the canisters fell short. So if you're looking at sometimes, you'll see the smoke on the ground in front of the demonstrators. Well, I guess they were trying to shoot it, but it fell short. It was also made ineffective by the wind, so you also saw it blowing.
They begin deploying the gas, and many of the students begin running from the area. Many of these students had just stopped to watch what was happening as they were walking through campus and were not part of the protest. The wind reduces the effectiveness of the tear gas, and some students stop on Blanket Hill near Taylor Hall to watch and see what will happen next. Angered that the Ohio National Guard is on campus making the rules and that their peaceful protest has been broken up with the use of tear gas, other students run back into the commons. They pick up the smoking tear gas containers and throw them back at the National Guardsmen. This goes on for a few minutes, and now more students join in throwing the tear gas back at the National Guard.
So the question is, why are you throwing the tear gas back at the National Guardsmen? Just try to walk away. Don't antagonize the military.
It is obvious to General Canterbury that the students are not going to leave the area. While the tear gas is being deployed, more Ohio National Guard troops move into position and prepare to move the students from the area. There is a very brief pause in the deployment of tear gas as the students watch the newly arriving troops getting their gas masks on. Once the troops were ready, General Canterbury gives the orders to move out and push the students from the area. On the left flank is Charlie Company 145th Infantry. In command is Major Jones. In the center is G Group 107th Armored Cavalry Regiment. In command, Lieutenant Colonel Fassinger. And on the right is Alpha Company 145th Infantry with General Canterbury.
And you're seeing how they have the formations of the National Guardsmen set. And as the story continues, you're going to see that some of the demonstrators are being boxed in. So are they panicking? Do they feel the pressure? And is that why they continue to ignore the guardsmen?
Just before starting to move into the commons, the National Guard began deploying tear gas again on the watching students. Terry Norman is spotted wearing a gas mask as he takes photos of students on the commons.
But something made me feel very uncomfortable when the guards got marching up towards the top of the hill next to Taylor Hall. And my dorm was right there. And I thought, I think I'll run over to the dorm and go up to third story. And on the corner of the dorms, we had study halls. In those days, we had a corner study hall. So I ran up to third story, and in the study hall, we had big glass windows, and then we had windows that you could roll out. So what I did was I rolled the one window out, and took the screen out, and I sat out from the window, and I put my legs out the window and hung onto the window, and I started taking pictures.
For some reason, my instincts told me to hang around the National Guard. So my recollection is a gentleman by the name of Ike Pappas from CBS started to follow the guardsmen as they advanced into the commons and up the hill. And with my press pass, I followed right behind him. I can't find myself in any pictures of that, but that is what I did.
More tear gas was fired, and all the observers, which is 99% of the people there, decided they better get out of there. They didn't want to breathe the gas. A lot of them went through Taylor Hall, stopped in the bathroom, wiped the tear gas out of their eyes, maybe picked up a towel or a paper towel and went out the backside of Taylor Hall and gathered on it was kind of a patio surrounding the building on the backside near the Don Drum sculpture.
Being behind the National Guard was a very weird experience because I thought, well, I'm on assignment for Life magazine. That's a big deal. I can't be taking one side or the other. I can't just be taking the student side or the National Guard side. They've asked me to take events and take pictures of the whole event. So I'm down there now to taking pictures of, guard lining up, guard with their gas masks on already. Also, their bayonets still purchased on top of their M1s. And thinking that, I didn't think much was going to happen. I mean, just, because it's lunchtime and people are still wandering back and forth. And when it's lunchtime, sure, there are classes going on, but most of the students are deciding what I'm going to have for lunch, or they're going to class, meet somebody in a dorm, whatever. And when they started marching up the hill, it was very unreal.
And as they're talking about marching up the hill, so as the advancing guardsmen approached the crowd, tear gas was again fired at the crowd, making the protesters retreat. At this point, some protesters threw stones again at the guard to no significant effect. So it wasn't working.
I had a 200 millimeter lens on my camera, so I didn't have to get very close. I was fairly far back from the real action, and I could follow the guard as they went up. And I thought, it's unreal. They're actually moving these students up the hill. And the thought in my mind was, where are they going to go? And they went on both sides, and I met John Philo, and we were both talking for a few minutes before we decided where else to go, because the guard had already dispersed, so we go down on both sides of Taylor Hall. And he asked if we could borrow a lens, and I said, I have a short little lens, you can use a little zoom, and he took that, and he said, I'm going to go up this side. I said, well, I'll go up this side.
As the National Guard begin to move into the Commons, students can be seen running away between Taylor Hall and Prentice Hall. Students clear the Commons as the National Guard moves forward. Some of the tear gas canisters are thrown back at the troops, and a few students have begun to throw rocks at the line of National Guardsmen. At approximately 12:02 p.m., the Ohio National Guard began moving from the area of the ROTC building into the Commons. C Company moved forward to take a position between Taylor Hall and Prentice Hall to keep the students from returning to the Commons. G Group and A Company's objective was to move the students off Blanket Hill between Taylor Hall and Johnson Hall. As C Company nears the tree line, they begin to fire tear gas back towards the students following them from the tennis court area. G Group and A Company continue to fire tear gas as they move toward Blanket Hill. C Company also encounters a student that was ringing the victory bell and then threw a rock at them in the area.
So as you're looking at this, you see that the two areas where the guardsmen were going, that they were tossing tear gas at the demonstrators. And then the one guy over there is throwing a rock, really, at the National Guardsmen. My question is, well, why don't they just go away if they see the military is coming after them? Then just try to walk away.
This encounter became physical as the National Guard troops struck the student and attempted to apprehend him. The student was able to escape from the troops and enter Taylor Hall. G Group and A Company continue toward Blanket Hill, firing tear gas as they move forward. The students continue to flee the area and keep their distance from the approaching troops. The television news media began following behind the line of the guardsmen, but stopped in the middle of the Common. Students are seen throwing rocks at the approaching line of troops.
So again, where that square is at, so students are seen throwing rocks. Are they throwing rocks defending themselves, or are they throwing rocks to tell the guardsmen to leave them alone? And this is still before the shooting.
Students that ran from the gas have now stopped at the top of Blanket Hill and look to see if they are still being followed. Terry Norman is spotted near the Johnson Hall parking lot taking photos of all that is happening. William McGuire is spotted on the Taylor Hall Terrace taking photos of the approaching National Guard troops. William's photos show a student being stopped and questioned by the troops in the Johnson Hall parking lot. Chuck Ayers was in the parking lot and took this close-up of that interaction. William McGuire continues to take photos as the National Guard moves up Blanket Hill.
So, as the advancing guardsmen approached the crowd, tear gas was again fired at them, making the protesters retreat, as they've been doing. So the students retreated up and over Blanket Hill, heading out of the Commons area. Once over the hill, the students in a loose group moved northeast along the front of Taylor Hill, with some continuing toward a parking lot in front of Prentice Hall. Wow. The guardsmen pursued the protesters over the hill, but rather than veering left, as the protesters had, they continued straight, heading toward an athletic practice field enclosed by a chain link fence. Here they remained for about 10 minutes, unsure of how to get out of the area, short of retracing their path. Wow, so it looks like the guardsmen were confused. During this time, the bulk of the students assembled to the left in front of the guardsmen. Wow. Others were scattered between Taylor Hall and the Prentice Hall parking lot, while still others were standing in the parking lot or dispersing through the lot as they had been previously ordered. While on the practice field, which we talked about, the guardsmen generally faced the parking lot. At one point, the guardsmen formed a loose huddle and appeared to be talking to one another. They had cleared the protesters from the Commons area, and many students had left. So there, right there, it seemed like they're moving a little bit, meaning the protesters.
Other than a few students in the Johnson Hall parking lot, the majority of students continue running from the approaching troops and tear gas. They move over Blanket Hill and around the pagoda.
So I'm going up the hill between Taylor Hall and Johnson Hall, and I had taken some photographs of Barry and Allison at the pagoda.
Howard can be seen taking the photo of Allison and Barry over these troops moving up the hill. The students continue to throw back tear gas canisters that have landed on top of Blanket Hill and around the pagoda. G Group and A Company continue up Blanket Hill. These troops move up the hill with no resistance other than a student or two throwing rocks. The students disperse in every direction. Very few students remain near the pagoda at the top of Blanket Hill. After moving between Taylor Hall and Johnson Hall, the troops spread out, moving students away from Johnson Hall. C Company takes a position between Taylor Hall and Prentice Hall to keep students from returning to the Commons. G Group and A Company have reached the pagoda and cleared the area.
So they pretty much have it where the students won't be able to come back. So what happened next?
It has been approximately 20 minutes since Officer Rice gave the first orders to disperse. This Chris Abel film shows a National Guard tear gas canister overshooting the top of Blanket Hill and landing just past the fence line on the practice field. Students can be seen moving away from the approaching troops. The students are fleeing towards Lake Hall, the gymnasium, the practice field, Prentice Hall, and the Prentice Hall parking lot. The troops are visible in the film moving between the trees. For some reason, General Canterbury makes the decision to have the troops follow a group of students heading towards the practice field. G Group and A Company troops pursue the students moving towards the fence line on the practice field. The students start to bunch up as they wait their turn to get through a small gate in the fence that is on 3 sides of the practice field.
So are they doing that, the students, because they're trying to get away and get off the grounds? Or are they just trying to move somewhere else and demonstrate?
This group of students that stopped at the fence gate become the focus of the guardsmen. C Company holds its position and watches G Group and A Company move into the practice field. Hundreds of students have just rushed through the Prentice Hall parking lot out into Midway Road between Prentice Hall and Dunbar Hall. All of the students made their way through the gate opening once G Group and A Company arrive on the practice field. The troops can be seen standing around, their objective completed. The students are dispersed.
All right, looks like job was done, but I guess not.
They could easily return to the commons without further incident. Looking closely at this photo, you can see that General Canterbury is looking towards Midway Road between Prentice Hall and Dunbar Hall. This is where many students have stopped to see what will happen next. This crowd has caught the attention of Canterbury and others. Another strange event taking place is Terry Norman walking within the National Guard formation. No other student photographers are near the area.
When they got down to the open flat area, I thought, what are they doing? Because they walked into this area and it was like no one was telling them what to do. They were just walking. And they walked down to the flat area and there was a chain link fence all the way around, and they walked into the area at the end of the chain link fence with nowhere to go.
The guard on the practice football field looked, they didn't look like a cohesive group of people. The people on the guard got to the practice football field and found out that they couldn't go anywhere. They didn't look very cohesive. They didn't look very, they didn't look like they knew what they were doing. They got trapped and they didn't expect it. And the other thing was, how far did they think they were going to chase these students across campus? Because unlike a lot of campuses, Kent is huge.
With troops still awaiting orders and a fence to their front and on both sides, the only option is to return the way they came. But the troops are ordered to move down the fence line. Major Jones, concerned that the troops are stopped at the fence, decides to leave C Company and runs into the practice field to assist. Jones meets up with General Canterbury and is seen in this photo pointing to the location of C Company between Taylor Hall and Prentice Hall. Terry Norman is still seen walking around with the National Guard troops. The troops extend their line from the fence gate down to the backstop of a softball area on the practice field. There is a fence that separates the practice field from the Prentice Hall parking lot. Initially, the students run from the parking lot towards Midway Road and move away from the approaching troops. The students soon notice that troops cannot follow because the fence has stopped their movements. Some students begin to return to the parking lot. Some start throwing rocks. Students begin to move out onto the hill in front of Taylor Hall. The longer the troops remain on the practice field, the more curious the students become, returning to the area, wondering what will happen next.
And that's an interesting part too. So they came back to that area wondering what would happen when maybe they should have stayed away.
This aerial photo helps with a better understanding of what is beginning to develop. Some of the students are moving back into the Prentice Hall parking lot from Midway Road, others starting to gather on the hill in front of Taylor Hall. The frustration of being on the practice field must have been growing with the troops. This photo captures what looks like a National Guardsman throwing a rock back towards.
So let's look at that picture. Is that a National Guardsman doing that? Is he throwing a rock at the protesters?
Prentice Hall parking lot and the students. Witnesses also say they saw and heard a pistol being fired by someone on the practice field. The FBI investigation would document this, and during the investigation found a spent shell casing on the practice field. The troops moved back, creating distance from the Prentice Hall parking lot and form an L-shaped formation.
There was some rock throwing and exchange of tear gas at that time from Prentice parking lot to the athletic field and back. The guard went through several skirmish lineups of trying to get in a threatening position to the students.
More students are now in the Prentice Hall parking lot with the National Guard stopped on the practice field and no longer following students. More students begin moving towards the campus, heading to different locations or just watching what is happening. In an attempt to intimidate and possibly get the students to move back, some of the troops take a knee and aim their rifles at the students in the parking lot.
And that's pretty much something you shouldn't do. Why would you aim your rifles at some of the demonstrators? That may antagonize them even more.
The troops fire tear gas at two growing groups, one in the Prentice Hall parking lot and others gathering on the hill near Taylor Hall. Students pick up the tear gas and throw it back at the troops, and more students begin throwing rocks towards the practice field. The FBI.
So when you're throwing rocks at the National Guards and they're sending tear gas your way, then somebody has to be the better person to walk away.
Investigation documents that during this time frame, the most rocks were thrown at the National Guard by the students. This recording of a student yelling to the National Guard shows that they were getting bolder. Jeff Miller is seen in these photos. He is standing with a group of students near Midway Road. He then can be seen moving towards the Prentice Hall parking lot as other students move in that direction. And lastly, he can be seen throwing a tear gas canister towards the National Guard, who are about 50 to 60 yards from him.
So as I went down to the end of the walk there by the street, I was pretty far to the left of the practice football field, and I turned and took some pictures of the students on the street and some pictures of students in the parking lot. And one of the students had a prophetic sign that said dead end.
The troops maintained their position on the practice field, but their frustration must have been building as they just waited for orders on what to do next.
So they're kneeling right there with their pistols of tear gas lined up against the demonstrators, trying to figure out what to do next. What would you do in that situation?
Several students move around the fence and enter the practice field, getting closer to the troops. Their actions seem to embolden more students to return to the area. Many witnesses talk about a meeting of the National Guard leaders on the practice field and what was discussed.
And then the strangest thing happened was, well, maybe not strange because you have to have a plan. So the leaders of the National Guard who were there, General Canterbury, Major Jones, one of the lieutenants, they all got together in a group and talked about things. And while they were doing that, another group of National Guard formed a semicircle of about 5 or 6 National Guard with their guns pointed toward the space between Prentice Hall and the area right across the street where the students were. And that's when Alan Canfora was waving a black anarchist flag at them, and they were directly pointing their weapons at him. And you could tell it was starting to get to be very, very threatening. It was not a comfortable time to be in either one of those places.
Many claim that this is when the decision to open fire on the students at the pagoda was made. There is no evidence, and no guardsman has ever come forward with information to support that claim. More than likely, the discussion was how to get back to the commons after being on the practice field for roughly 10 minutes, and with limited tear gas left to disperse the growing crowd of students. Shortly after this gathering, the troops formed up to move back towards the commons. The time is approximately 12:18.
There was a lull in the action, and I decided that I had 2 still cameras with me. I had a movie camera in my trunk, so I decided I was going to try to sneak around behind the parking lot and get down in the parking lot and get my movie camera. But as I was doing this, I noticed that the sound of the crowd was getting louder and louder. My back was to the crowd, my back was to the guard. I was walking to the graduate student parking lot, which is across the street from the Prentice parking lot. And I thought to myself, gee, are these kids behind me? And I turned around and they weren't. They were just much louder because it looked like the guard was going back up the hill. And I think the kids were deciding that they had won a victory, and they were just like a sporting event, cheering and getting more boisterous. And I thought to myself, I wonder if the guard knows that the kids aren't behind them either. But I could see how they might think that they were being pursued, because the noise was noticeably louder, as even though I was getting further away from the crowd.
So as you can tell, the kids, they did not leave, and they were getting louder, and the National Guardsmen were getting more anxious.
As the National Guard began moving back up the hill towards the pagoda, some of the students began following. The noise level and cheers were getting louder and louder. The troops were moving without using tear gas, and some thought they may have used all they had. The students on the hill in front of Taylor Hall began moving from the area, clearing a path for the troops to move forward. Many students began heading for the next classes. Sandra Sandy Scheuer is seen walking towards her next class in the Prentice parking lot. The students clear a path for the troops to move back to the commons and then stand and watch, thinking that it was over. Others begin to follow the troops as they move back up the hill, taunting and throwing rocks from a distance.
So as it seemed like everything was trying to get back to normal, there were a couple kids that were still causing trouble. Like the guy right there, if he's supposedly either taunting or throwing some kind of object at the National Guardsmen.
And they started moving out of that area, and they moved up the hill. And the students followed them. Some of the students backed off, and I didn't see anybody get real close to them that I can remember. And then they moved up the hill.
At which point, for whatever reason, I left the hill, turned to my left, went up a set of steps, and positioned myself behind the first pylon of Taylor Hall. The front of the facade of the building has several concrete pylons, and I was on the pylon closest to the end of the building. I was behind it.
The troops move up the hill. They keep their distance from the students standing near Taylor Hall. The students follow them, causing concern. A National Guardsman's statement to the FBI claims that he heard a sergeant tell the troops that if they rush us, shoot them. Another National Guardsman claims that as they were approaching the trees, a student stepped out from behind the tree and threw a piece of wood. It landed near his foot. As he continued moving up the hill, the same student went to pick up the wood again, and at this point, Major Jones stepped forward and yelled at the student. Student photographers were seen running close to the troops. Terry Norman is believed to be in this area and possibly throwing rocks at students.
Well, some of them were National Guardsmen who witnessed it. I think it was Sergeant Day, and there were also some students like Tom Masterson who claimed he positioned himself right in between the guardsmen and the students and threw half a dozen or a dozen rocks. Norman himself said he threw 2 or 3, but why is this guy throwing rocks at students? Was he trying to provoke an incident? It's never really been answered.
From a distance, students continue to throw things at the moving troops, but the distance and trees keep most items from reaching the soldiers. The National Guardsmen can be seen almost to the pagoda. In this photo, Allison Krause is seen watching the troops from the Prentice parking lot. Jeffrey Miller is seen in this photo walking in the practice field almost to the access road.
And I took a couple pictures, and then all of a sudden, when they got to the top of the hill, they turned around.
Some turned with intent. Some may not have turned with intent.
Greg Moore's photos show the troops at the pagoda. Some of the troops are looking back. Others are still moving forward. What is interesting with this photo is that one or two have already turned around, but as a group, they will continue to move forward. The troops will pass the corner of the Taylor Hall terrace railing and down from the pagoda to the area where the dirt meets the grass. This William Frederick photo was taken just seconds before the shooting started. There are a few things to note in this photo. Some of the troops are still walking and have not turned around. Others are just starting to turn, and others are already moving towards the pagoda. What is key in this photo is the troops moving towards the pagoda and looking to the left of the photo. This is the area where just moments before, a student had been confronted after throwing wood at the troops. You can see that the students are in the area. Howard Ruffner's photo captures the moment just seconds before the firing takes place. Howard had his back towards the Prentice Hall parking lot, and the troops are looking and moving to his left. This National Guardsman is aiming towards Ruffner and the Prentice Hall parking lot, a very obvious difference to the others.
Yeah, because if you looked at that last picture, the guy was pointing towards literally us while the other guys were going straight. I wonder what he was looking at.
Topol's photo is taken at almost the same time as Howard's, and you can see that the troops are moving back up towards the pagoda, their backs towards Taylor Hall. The Chris Bell film shows the National Guard location and the students near Taylor Hall.
"13 seconds, 67 shots at 12:26 p.m. So now during their climb back to Blanket Hill, several guardsmen stopped and half turned to keep their eyes on the students in the Prentice Hall parking lot. That's what we just saw. At 12:24 p.m., according to eyewitnesses, a sergeant named Myron Pryor turned and began firing at the crowd of students with his .45 pistol. Several gunsmen nearest the students also turned and fired their rifles at the students, and in all, at least 29, listen to this, 29 of the 77 guardsmen claimed to have fired their weapons using an estimated 67 rounds of ammunition. So 29 of the 77 guardsmen fired. Wow. And this was determined to last 13 seconds. But at least one person said it could have lasted a minute at least. Wow. When the guard began firing, many protesters ran while others stopped or dropped on the ground. Some assumed the guard was firing blanks and reacted only after they noticed the bullets striking the ground around them. 13 seconds, 67 shots, 12:26 p.m., 4 people killed. Started out as a peaceful protest.
They turned around and they were there, and I can't tell you for how long, it wasn't very long. And that's when we heard the bullets, that we heard the guns being fired.
And I think with considerable accuracy that I was the closest person to the guard when they started firing. And in that split second when the firing began, I was standing outside of the pylon. And it took me, gosh, a split second to realize maybe they are firing real weapons. I heard no order, no common talk between the guard. My observation was they just turned and began firing.
On the way back, when they turned and fired, I was 80 feet behind the guard. I was following them up the hill, and I just decided to get down because it was time. You know, I looked like a person with a weapon on my chest with a long lens. And when I got down, I thought, yeah, they're shooting over our heads. I mean, this is a typical kind of thing you see it on TV: shoot over their heads or shoot blanks or whatever. But then you hear, oh my God, they're shooting real bullets. Get down, stay down. They're shooting real bullets. There's a person bleeding over here. That's when it began real. It was very scary.
John Darnell's photo captures the first seconds of the National Guard opening fire on the students. Just a few students are moving up the hill towards the troops. The sudden reaction of the students turning and running signals the worst possible outcome of the protest. Look closely in these locations. Slowing the film down to show each frame, you can see what appears to be dirt and dust flying into the air from bullets hitting the ground. The same dirt and dust can be seen being kicked up in this Paul Topple photo as bullets are hitting the ground. The firing has started and people are reacting. Joe Louis is standing, facing the troops. Howard Ruffner is starting to kneel down near the railing. A student is watching another student further away, running from the gunfire. Watch the Chrisabel film again for the dirt and dust in the air. From this aerial photo, the first bullets fired are hitting in this area. This is the area where just then a minute earlier, a student had thrown a piece of wood at one of the soldiers and Major Jones. It is believed that Terry Norman was somewhere in this general area when the shooting started. What most people do not remember is that James Russell was wounded by shots fired by the National Guard while he was in this area. Why would the National Guard troops need to move back on top of the hill by the pagoda? That's because it slopes down on the other side of the pagoda and anyone in that area would be hidden from their view. In this photo taken just days after, you can see how the ground slopes down. The dirt and dust seen in the Chrisabel film would be just to the left of the light pole. This modern video shows how anybody on the opposite side of the pagoda would not be visible until you walked up the hill. The dust and bullet strikes from the first shots fired were near the light pole and display sign. In this modern photo from the corner of Taylor Hall, it is a clear view of the Prentice Hall parking lot and would not require the troops to get to a higher elevation.
As I got to my car, I put my keys in the trunk, popped the lid, dropped the Nikons in the trunk, opened the case to the movie camera, flipped open the handle, and I heard the shots. And I thought, well, they're shooting over their heads, and I could actually hear going over my head. And I thought, whoa, that's pretty. I never saw the police or anybody do anything like for just a student demonstration. But I turned around, pulled the trigger of the camera, and through the viewfinder, I saw the kids running right toward my camera and hitting the ground. I'm assuming they are shot at the time, but it was kind of a disconnect that they would actually be shot. I mean, they were probably shooting over their heads and they were just diving for cover. Well, it was the opposite of that.
What is interesting in this film and supports the idea of the National Guard firing over the hill is that the students are running and taking cover. Firing has been going on for a few seconds and Joe Louis and John Clary are still standing. This film frame shows the students laying on the ground between the pine trees in front of Taylor Hall and the access road. The National Guard troops can be seen near the pagoda. This is the area of the students in the Ling film. Most viewers focus on all the students in front of Taylor Hall, but just as the shooting stops, notice that there is a tear gas canister fired on the left of the screen. This is roughly the area where the student threw wood at a soldier and Major Jones, also possibly the area Terry Norman was spotted throwing rocks at students. James Russell was wounded by firing National Guard troops in this general area.
And that's interesting because, yeah, that's the area where those two students supposedly were throwing objects at the National Guardsmen.
What is happening here that is getting the troops' attention? Why did the troops suddenly use tear gas when they hadn't fired any since they were on the practice field? Focusing on the troops' actions during the shooting, just as the troops passed the pagoda, Major Jones and General Canterbury appear to be shocked that the troops have opened fire. You can see other troops seem to be surprised and looking to see what is happening. Many of the troops gave statements that they heard no command to fire, but rather reacted to the action of the other troops, believing that there was a command to fire. The idea of the troops reacting to others is clear in this photo, as only a few have turned and the others are still moving forward. These sudden changes by a few would immediately be replicated by the others. A guardsman did state that he yelled to fire over their heads. The meaning was not to shoot into the group of students, but over their heads once the firing had begun. Jones and Canterbury moved towards the firing troops and can be seen physically grabbing and forcefully pushing the troops to stop firing. Another claim is that the troops kneeled and fired, but no photo has ever shown troops kneeling in unison. But the photos do show some of the troops crouching slightly. Take a look at this person with a .45 handgun. We can see in this photo that the handgun is in the ready position with the slide forward. Just a few seconds later, the slide is in the locked back position.
So some of the reasons, and you look at that picture, he's about to fire, but some of the reasons that they say that they opened fire, they testified that they fired because they feared for their lives, which was questioned partly because of distance between them and the protesting students. They claimed they feared for their lives, variously listed an assortment of reasons, including they were surrounded, the crowd was pursuing them, almost on top of them, the prosecutors charged them or were advancing on them in a threatening manner, and the sky was black with stones and a sniper fired at them. Some listed a combination of multiple such reasons, and some gave no explanation as to why they believed their lives were in danger. Most gunmen that fired said they did so because they heard others fire. Wow, so much confusion.
Possibly from being fired. This Beverly Knowles burger photo is incredible with all that is happening. The shooting has just stopped. The troops are just standing at the pagoda watching. Tear gas is blowing in the wind. Students are getting up and running away. The students that were wounded or killed in this photo are Joseph Lewis, John Cleary, Thomas Grace, Alan Canfora, Jeffrey Miller, Dean Kaler, Douglas Rentmore, Allison Krauss, William Schroeder, Sandy Scheuer.
And it was dead silent almost. It was still very, and then it was a split second of me seeing just, there were people still running, but people were hunkered down and it was very quiet. I heard some things and I could hear a few people screaming, but it was sort of quiet. And then all of a sudden it crescendoed. You could hear people screaming. They were yelling for help. They were asking for medical care. They were saying help.
But right after that firing, that was silence, and that was followed by a realization by many people that kids were shot and some were dead, and it was that's something you don't want to remember too much of.
Yes, it's something you don't want to remember too much of. But as I always say, if you don't remember the past, it will tend to come back and bite you. Wow. Kent State killings in 1970. Again, 28 National Guardsmen fired about 67 rounds over 13 seconds. Killing students Allison Krauss, 19, Jeffrey Glenn Miller, 20, Sandra Lee Schreider, 20, and William Knox Schroeder, 19. Wow. So, again, you've been watching. Keeping it honest with yours truly, Anthony Parker. And we don't just keep it simple. We don't just keep it real. We keep it honest. And what do you have to say? Questions, comments? You can email yours truly, parkerman2011@gmail.com, parkerman2011@gmail.com. Text me 216-702-3718, 216-702-3718. So you saw what happened at the Kent State riot. Start out as a peaceful protest. People wind up getting hurt and killed. Let's not let this happen again.
We will not stop. We will not rest. This road. We will not stop. We will not rest. This road. We will not stop. We will not rest. This road. We will not stop. We will not rest. This road. We will not stop. We will not rest. This road. We will not rest. This road.
You look at those protests there, and you think about the Kent State one, and is there a difference? Something to think about. So as I talked about earlier, talked about that bill. And if you don't keep up with the law, when things happen, you'll be surprised. This is HR 6090. It's an act, the Anti-Semitism Act. If passed, when passed, will change how demonstrators and protesters protest. So now, this commentary I got. The House anti-Semitism bill is bad for the Jews and free speech. This is by Jonathan Chatt. He's a New York political columnist. And this is what he says, how this bill that I just showed you is bad. So the House of Representatives passed the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which requires colleges to enforce rules on discrimination using a definition that equates anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. The problem of campus anti-Israel activism creating an atmosphere of anti-Semitism is real. The solution of regulating anti-Zionism as hate speech is observed. Representative Josh Gottheimer, a moderate Democrat and co-sponsor of the bill, is at least blunt about what he hopes the bill would accomplish. It allows criticism of Israel, he said. It doesn't allow calls for the destruction or elimination of the Jewish state. But why shouldn't colleges allow students or faculty to call for the destruction or elimination of the state of Israel? To be clear, destroying or eliminating Israel is a ghastly idea that can only be accomplished through Hitlerian scale violence. Colleges are supposed to allow people to advocate bad ideas. What makes the bill so controversial among Democrats is its relevance on equating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. That equation is accepted as a truism on the right and among many Israel supporters, but it rests on shaky grounds. Zionism was a solution Jews devised for the problem of epidemic discrimination. Centuries of experience had shown that even countries that initially welcomed them eventually discriminated against them, expelled them, or murdered them. The crisis grew especially acute after the Holocaust, which left the Jewish survivors homeless and stateless. The latter problem hasn't fundamentally changed. If Israel's Jewish population were somehow persuaded to leave, where would they go? Nobody, including the United States, is lining up to take in 7 million Jewish immigrants. You can disagree historically with the premise of Zionism without being anti-Semitic. Not every ethnic group enjoys self-determination. Is it bigotry to oppose statehood for Kurds or Tibians? You can even believe that somehow the Jewish population of Israel will survive and prosper in a world in which their state has dissolved, because naivety is not bigotry. In practice, anti-Zionism activism tends to place intense pressure on Jews to abandon their communal traditions to be accepted into the wider community. It has long been a force of life that progressive active spaces often require participants to renounce Israel as a price of admission to groups and causes that have nothing to do with Israel. Since Jewish people disproportionately, if not universally, believe in Israel's existence in one form or another, this informal requirement amounts to de facto discrimination. The encampments that have sprung up around campuses provide a vivid sense of this discrimination in its most literal form. Student protests have illegally seized campus spaces for their exclusive use. Their first step has been to bar Zionists from entering territory that they control. Encampment after encampment has established rules barring Zionists from areas of campus that remain open to non-Zionists. At UCLA, the protesters seem to have set up checkpoints they use to keep Zionists from accessing parts of campus. This is functionally anti-Semitism. They may not be preventing Jews per se from accessing these areas, but they have created a litmus test that will effectively deter many and perhaps most Jewish students while creating a general atmosphere of discrimination and fear. Predictably, the UCLA method of giving radical students enormous control of portions of campus quickly spiraled into anarchy, and pro-Israel counter-demonstrations unleashed horrific, and to be clear, totally wrong, violence that night. It is the spectacle of these sort of unauthorized encampments that have caused Congress to leap to its legislative response. We must give the Department of Education the tools to hold college administrators accountable for refusing to address anti-Semitism on their campuses, said Republican Representative Michael Loyer of New York, a lead sponsor. But the tools to handle these actions already exist. Colleges simply need to enforce their time, place, manner restrictions on public spaces. Those restrictions not only don't need to piggyback on defining anti-Zionism as hate speech, they shouldn't. Effective and legitimate rules about public spaces must be content neutral. If you want to hold a march at the National Mall, you need to get a permit, and those permits aren't granted on the basis of whether or not your case is hateful. Campuses allocate their public space the same way. If you obstruct the way from the merits of the cause, the need to regulate common space on campuses is obvious. The Glee Club isn't allowed to set up camp on the quad and decide they want to make everybody listen to their stage songs day and night. Protesters who hate Israel can't do that either. The crisis of anti-Semitism on campuses is ultimately going to require a solution required or arrived at through force of reason. That is to say, a liberal solution. You don't win the argument by having Congress pass a vote saying you're right. Wow. And there you have it. Some people think that law that's passing may not is good. Some people say it's not. But again, you have to go through the channels. And as you've seen how we've done this show, we tried to give you all sides of the story. We hope you've enjoyed it. If you have any questions or comments, you can email yours truly at parkerman2011@gmail.com, parkerman2011@gmail.com. Telephone number, you want to text me, leave a voicemail, 216-702-3718, 216-702-3718. Also, don't forget to like and share the button and subscribe. Remember, like I said at the top of the show and throughout the show, if we don't remember what happened in the past and tend to forget what happened, we will repeat it. At this stage of what's happening with the college campuses, the wars, let's try to do a collaboration and put an ease to everything that's happening. Like when there's war, both sides, we can come together and have some kind of peace. Something to think about. 1970, May 4th, Kent State riots. Started off peaceful, ended off badly. Let's not let any of these things that are going on in the college campuses in the same way. I'm Anthony Parker. Keep your head up, never look down, always believe in yourself, and therein will lie your answer. And we will talk again. God bless.